At a busy international airport, two twin sisters were getting ready to head back home after attending an important business event. These sisters weren't just any ordinary pair. They had this rare kind of bond that made people stop and notice them. They looked almost identical with matching hairstyles and outfits, but what really caught everyone's attention was how calm they seemed in the middle of all the chaos around them. While other travelers were rushing here and there, trying to make their flights on time, these two moved like they didn't have a care in the world. The airport was packed, families lugging suitcases, kids running around, announcements blaring. Over the loudspeakers, it was one of those days when everything felt extra hectic. But for the twins, it was just another day of travel. They'd been through airports countless times before, so they knew exactly what to expect. Long lines at security, scanners beeping, maybe a quick pat-down if something set off the machine. Nothing out of the ordinary, or so they thought. As they approached the TSA checkpoint, things started off normally enough. The line moved slowly, as usual, and they chatted quietly about the conference they'd attended earlier that week. Both sisters were proud of the work they'd done there, presenting ideas that could help improve communities. They felt good about themselves and their mission, which gave them a sense of confidence as they handed over their boarding passes and IDs to the officer at the desk. But then, something unusual happened. When their bags went through the X-ray machine, one of the new pieces of equipment suddenly glitched. The screen flickered and the operator frowned, unsure of what was going on. This wasn't something that happened every day, and it immediately drew the attention of the nearby security staff. One of the officers motioned for the twins to step aside so they could take a closer look at their belongings. Now, anyone would feel a little uneasy being pulled out of line like that. People tend to assume the worst when they're singled out, especially in places like airports where tensions can run high. But the sisters didn't panic. Instead, they exchanged a glance, just a quick look that said, "Let's stay cool and see what happens," and that's exactly what they did. They followed the instructions calmly, setting their bags down on the table for inspection without saying much. At first, the security team seemed professional enough. They opened the bags carefully, checking each item one by one. But as the search dragged on, one of the officers started acting differently. His tone changed. He became sharper, more demanding. He asked questions that felt unnecessary, almost accusatory. "Why do you have this?" he'd say, holding up a perfectly harmless item like a laptop charger. "What's inside this container?" Referring to a small jar of face cream, "3 sisters answered politely, explaining everything clearly. Still, the officer didn't seem satisfied. Maybe he was having a bad day, or maybe he was under pressure because of the equipment malfunction. Whatever the reason, his behavior began to shift from curious to confrontational. That's when things took a turn no one saw coming. Passengers waiting in line started noticing the tension between the officers and the twins. Some craned their necks to get a better view, while others whispered to each other, wondering what was going on. A few even pulled out their phones, sensing that this might not end well. Meanwhile, the sisters stayed composed, though you could tell they were starting to feel frustrated. They hadn't done anything wrong, yet they were being treated like suspects. And then, just as the situation seemed like it couldn't get any worse, another officer arrived on the scene. This one looked even more agitated than the first. His presence added a whole new layer of unease to the already tense atmosphere. You could practically feel the energy in the room shifting like a storm cloud moving in. No one knew it yet, but this was only the beginning of a story that would leave the entire airport talking and shaking their heads for days to come. What happened next would test not only the sisters' patience but also the courage of everyone who witnessed it. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The second officer who had arrived on the scene didn't waste any time jumping into the fray. His face was stern, his jaw clenched tightly as if he were ready for battle. He barked orders at the twins, his voice sharp and commanding, demanding they empty their bags completely onto the table. Every item, chargers, notebooks, toiletries, was inspected with what felt like unnecessary scrutiny. By now, the line of passengers waiting to get through security had backed up significantly. People were growing restless, shifting from foot to foot, checking their watches and exchanging annoyed glances. But no one dared to say anything. Not yet. Everyone could sense that this wasn't just a routine check anymore. Something about the way the officers were behaving made it clear this situation was escalating fast. One of the sisters tried to explain again, her tone calm but firm. "We're cooperating fully," she said, gesturing toward the items spread out on the table. "There's nothing here that should raise any concerns." Her words sounded reasonable, even reassuring, but they seemed to have the opposite effect on the officers. Instead of easing up, the second officer stepped closer, invading their personal space in a way that felt aggressive and intimidating. "Why are you recording?" he snapped suddenly, pointing at the phone in the other sister's hand. She had been quietly filming the interaction, holding the device steady while keeping her expression neutral. Without missing a beat, she replied, "I'm within my rights to document this. I haven't done anything wrong." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a quiet defiance that caught the attention of those nearby. That's when things took a turn nobody expected. The officer's face turned red, his patience clearly snapping. He reached for his holster, and before anyone could react, he pulled out his weapon. The sound of the gun clicking into place echoed loudly in the crowded terminal, silencing every conversation instantly. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Then came the first shot, a loud crack that reverberated through the space. It wasn't aimed directly at anyone. Instead, it went straight into the ceiling, shattering the fluorescent lights above. Glass shards rained down, glittering like deadly confetti. Panic erupted immediately. People screamed, dropping to the floor or scrambling backward in terror. Some threw themselves behind luggage carts, using them as makeshift shields. Others simply froze, too shocked to move. Babies cried, and the once bustling checkpoint became a scene of pure chaos. The noise was deafening, a mix of shouting, crying, and the dull thud of footsteps as people tried to escape the danger zone. Amidst all this madness, the two sisters stood rooted to the spot. Their faces showed a mixture of fear and disbelief, but they didn't run or cower. They locked eyes briefly, sharing a silent understanding. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. And then, unbelievably, the officer fired 2 more shots into the air. Each blast sent another wave of panic rippling through the crowd, but somehow the twins remained standing tall. What happened next shocked everyone who witnessed it. One of the sisters raised her hands slowly, palms facing outward in a gesture of peace. Her movements were deliberate, almost hypnotic in their calmness. "We are not a threat," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the hysteria around her. "We've done nothing wrong." Her words carried a weight that silenced some of the screaming, drawing the attention of both the officers and the terrified passengers. Her twin stepped forward slightly, still holding the phone steady. Its camera lens captured every detail. The fear in the eyes of bystanders, the sweat beading on the officers' foreheads, the shattered glass littering the floor. "This is how you treat innocent people?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly but still strong. "Is this really necessary?" For a moment, the officers seemed taken aback. They exchanged uneasy glances as if unsure of what to do next. The crowd, too, began to shift. A few brave souls peeked out from behind their hiding spots, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. One older man muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous." Another woman whispered to her companion, "They're right. This isn't fair." The energy in the room started to change. What had begun as sheer panic was slowly transforming into something else. Anger, maybe, or frustration. Or perhaps it was solidarity. Either way, the sisters' courage was contagious. Slowly, people began to stand up again, brushing off dust and debris from their clothes. Some even started clapping softly, showing support for the women who refused to back down despite the chaos swirling around them. Even the security staff looked rattled. One of the officers lowered his weapon slightly, though he kept it close by his side. Another called over a supervisor, speaking urgently into his radio. It was clear they hadn't anticipated such a reaction from the twins, or from the crowd. The entire situation had spiraled far beyond what anyone could have predicted, and yet amidst all the confusion, One thing was undeniable. These two sisters had done something extraordinary. In the face of fear and aggression, they had chosen to stand their ground. Their actions weren't just brave, they were inspiring. Little did they know this moment would spark conversations that would reach far beyond the walls of the airport, touching lives across the country and beyond. As the seconds ticked by, the atmosphere in the terminal shifted in a way no one could have predicted. The sisters' calm defiance seemed to ripple through the crowd like a wave, awakening something deep within the people who had been frozen in fear just moments before. It wasn't loud or sudden. It was quiet at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew stronger with every passing second. One of the sisters, still holding her phone steady, took a small step forward. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if she wanted to make sure everyone watching understood that she wasn't backing down. "This is how you treat citizens?" she asked again, her voice louder this time, cutting through the lingering panic. "Is this what safety looks like to you?" Her words struck a nerve, not just with the officers but with the passengers around them. A middle-aged man nearby, clutching his carry-on bag tightly, let out an audible sigh. "She's right," he muttered under his breath, though it was loud enough for those closest to hear him. Another woman, gripping her young daughter's hand, nodded in agreement. "They haven't done anything wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. The mood in the room began to change. People who had initially ducked for cover or cowered behind luggage carts started standing up again. Some even moved closer, forming a loose semicircle around the checkpoint area. They weren't trying to confront the officers head-on, far from it, but their presence sent a clear message. They were watching, and they weren't going to stay silent anymore. Teenager with headphones dangling around his neck stepped forward hesitantly, raising his phone to record the scene. His hands shook slightly, but he kept the camera focused on the officers. Another passenger followed suit, then another, until multiple phones were capturing the moment from different angles. The sound of clicks and video recordings filled the air, blending with the nervous murmurs of the crowd. Meanwhile, the sisters continued to hold their ground. One of them spoke directly to the officers, her tone firm but controlled. "You've already fired 3 shots. What more do you want from us? We're cooperating fully." She gestured toward the scattered items on the table, laptops, toiletries, notebooks, all things any traveler might carry. "There's nothing dangerous here, so why are we being treated like criminals?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado visibly shaken. For a moment, it seemed like they didn't know what to do next. The supervisor who had arrived on the scene stood off to the side, talking urgently into his radio. His body language suggested he was trying to figure out a way to de-escalate the situation without losing face entirely. But the crowd wasn't willing to wait quietly anymore. Someone shouted from the back, "Leave them alone." Another voice joined in, "Yeah, they haven't done anything." Soon a chorus of voices rose up, echoing through the terminal. Passengers who had once been strangers to each other now found themselves united by a shared sense of outrage. Some clapped softly, while others simply stood tall, refusing to look away. The sisters, sensing the growing support around them, exchanged a glance. There was a flicker of relief in their eyes, but also determination. They knew they couldn't let this moment pass without saying what needed to be said. One of them raised her voice slightly, addressing not just the officers but the entire crowd. "We're not afraid to stand up for ourselves," she declared, "and neither should you be." Her words resonated deeply with those around her. A young mother holding her baby close wiped tears from her cheeks, nodding silently. An elderly man leaning on a cane gave a slow, approving nod. Even some of the airport staff, who had initially stayed out of the conflict, began whispering among themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief at how quickly the situation had spiraled out of control. The tension between the officers and the crowd reached a tipping point. One of the security personnel tried to regain control, shouting over the noise. "Everyone needs to calm down," he barked, his voice strained. But his command fell flat. No one listened. Instead, the calls for accountability only grew louder. Indiriti. The midst of all this, something remarkable happened. A flight attendant who had been waiting in line stepped forward, her uniform crisp and professional despite the chaos. She addressed the officers directly, her tone polite but unwavering. "Sir, I think we need to reconsider this approach," she said calmly. "These ladies have cooperated fully, and there's clearly no threat here. Let's resolve this peacefully." Her intervention seemed to break through the wall of tension. The officers hesitated, glancing at each other uncertainly. The supervisor, still talking into his radio, finally lowered it and approached the group. He didn't apologize. That would come later. But he did signal for the weapons to be holstered. The immediate danger, at least, appeared to be over. For the sisters, the relief was palpable but short-lived. They knew the fight wasn't finished. This incident wouldn't end here in this crowded terminal. It would follow them, shape them, and ultimately push them into a spotlight they hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. As the crowd began to disperse slowly, many people lingered, unwilling to leave until they were certain the twins were safe. Some offered hugs, others words of encouragement. "You handled that beautifully," one woman said, squeezing one of the sisters' hands. "Thank you for standing up. You gave us all courage." It was true. Their actions had sparked something powerful. In a place where fear and frustration often ruled, these two women had shown that bravery and unity could still prevail. And while they didn't yet realize it, their story was far from over. It was only beginning. Once the initial chaos began to settle, the terminal transformed into a space buzzing with quiet conversations and lingering tension. People who had been complete strangers just minutes ago now stood together in small clusters, sharing their thoughts about what they'd witnessed. The sisters were still at the center of it all, surrounded by a mix of concern, admiration, and curiosity. Some passengers approached them cautiously, offering words of support or simply thanking them for staying calm under such intense pressure. One older woman, her graying hair tucked neatly into a bun, walked up hesitantly. She reached out to touch one of the sisters' arms gently, her eyes filled with emotion. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You handled yourselves with so much grace. I don't know if I could have done the same." Her sincerity brought tears to the twins' eyes, but they nodded, accepting her kindness without saying much. They were overwhelmed, not just by the incident itself, but by the outpouring of solidarity from people they didn't even know. Others weren't as reserved. A young man wearing a hoodie and sneakers stepped forward boldly, his phone still recording. "This is insane," he said, shaking his head. "What these officers did was completely unnecessary. You should file a complaint, or better yet, sue them." His tone was passionate, almost fiery, and it drew nods of agreement from those around him. Another traveler chimed in. "He's right. This can't go unnoticed. Too many people let things like this slide because they're scared of retaliation. But you've already shown how strong you are. Don't stop now." The twins listened quietly, absorbing every word. They knew the young man had a point. This wasn't something they could just brush off and forget about once they boarded their flight. What had happened here wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern, one that countless others had experienced but rarely spoken about publicly. And while they hadn't planned on becoming advocates or symbols of resistance, they couldn't ignore the responsibility that came with being thrust into the spotlight. As the crowd continued to murmur around them, airport staff finally intervened in earnest. A manager arrived on the scene, flanked by two uniformed supervisors. His expression was unreadable, part apology, part frustration, but he addressed the sisters directly. "Ladies, I deeply regret what occurred here today," he began, his voice measured. "We're going to conduct a full review of this incident, and appropriate action will be taken against those involved." It sounded like a rehearsed statement, the kind of vague promise designed to placate without committing to anything concrete. One of the sisters raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "That's good to hear," she replied coolly, "but we'd appreciate more than just words. We need accountability and real change, so no one else has to go through this." Her response earned murmurs of approval from the crowd. Someone shouted, "Yeah, hold them accountable," Another added, "Make sure this doesn't happen again." The manager shifted uncomfortably under the weight of everyone's stares, but nodded nonetheless. "Understood," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. He motioned for the sisters to gather their belongings, assuring them they were free to proceed to their gate without further delays. But leaving wasn't easy. Not emotionally anyway. As they packed up their scattered items, the reality of what had just transpired began to sink in fully. Every glance from a fellow passenger, every whispered comment, served as a reminder of how extraordinary the moment had been. For the sisters, it wasn't just about surviving the ordeal, it was about recognizing its significance. They had become accidental heroes, standing firm when most would have crumbled. And now, whether they liked it or not, the world was watching. Before they could move away from the checkpoint, a journalist who had been waiting for a connecting flight approached them. She introduced herself quickly, explaining that she worked for a local news outlet. "Do you mind if I ask a few questions?" she asked, her pen poised over a notebook. "This is a major story and people need to hear your side of it." The sisters exchanged a glance, silently weighing their options. On one hand, they were exhausted and eager to put distance between themselves and the security team. On the other hand, they understood the power of storytelling, the ability to shine a light on injustice and inspire others to demand better. After a brief pause, one of them nodded. "Okay," she said firmly. "But only because we want people to know the truth." The interview was brief but impactful. They recounted the events calmly, emphasizing their desire for fairness and reform rather than revenge. Their words resonated deeply with the journalist, who promised to share their story widely. By the time they finished speaking, several other reporters had gathered, alerted by the commotion and the growing crowd. It was clear that this incident wasn't going to fade away quietly. As the sisters finally made their way toward their gate, accompanied by a mixture of applause and concerned glances, they couldn't help but reflect on everything that had unfolded. They had entered the airport as ordinary travelers, focused solely on catching their flight home. Now they were leaving as symbols of courage, their actions sparking a conversation that extended far beyond the confines of the terminal. Passengers along the concourse stopped to watch them pass, some offering smiles or thumbs-up gestures. Others simply stared, perhaps unsure of how to process what they'd seen. One elderly gentleman sitting near a coffee kiosk called out, "Stay strong, ladies. The world needs more people like you." His words lingered in the air, echoing softly, as the twins disappeared around a corner. Though they were physically moving closer to their destination, their journey was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, filled with media attention, public scrutiny, and difficult conversations. But they faced it with the same resolve that had carried them through the chaos at the checkpoint. Together, they vowed to use their experience as a catalyst for change, determined to ensure that no one else would ever endure what they had that day. For everyone else in the airport, life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after witnessing such a dramatic event. Flights resumed boarding. Announcements crackled over the intercom and passengers drifted back to their routines. But the memory of the sisters' bravery lingered, etched into the minds of those who had been there. It was a reminder that even in the face of fear and injustice, ordinary people could rise to the occasion and make their voices heard. And sometimes those voices could spark movements that changed the world. By the time the sisters finally boarded their flight, news of the incident had already started spreading like wildfire. Passengers who had recorded videos on their phones began uploading them to social media platforms, tagging hashtags that quickly gained traction. Within hours, the story was everywhere. News websites, talk shows, and even late-night comedy segments. The footage showed everything. The tense standoff at the checkpoint, the 3 gunshots fired into the air, and most importantly, the calm yet defiant response of the twins. The reaction online was immediate and overwhelming. People from all walks of life weighed in, sharing their thoughts and feelings about what they'd seen. Some praised the sisters for their bravery, calling them heroes who stood up against injustice. Others expressed outrage at the behavior of the officers, questioning how such an extreme overreaction could happen in the first place. "This is exactly why so many people are afraid of flying," one commenter wrote beneath a viral video. "It's not just about turbulence or delays. It's about being treated like a criminal when you haven't done anything wrong." For the sisters, however, the attention came as both a blessing and a burden. Once the plane took off, they finally had a moment to breathe and process everything that had happened. Sitting side by side in their seats, they leaned close to each other, speaking in hushed tones so as not to disturb the other passengers. One of them rested her forehead against the window, staring out at the clouds while the other scrolled through her phone, reading some of the comments flooding in under the videos. "It's crazy, isn't it?" one of them murmured, shaking her head. "We were just trying to get home. Now look at this." She gestured toward the screen where thousands of people were discussing their actions in real time. It wasn't just strangers chiming in. Friends, family members, and colleagues had reached out too, expressing shock, pride, and concern in equal measure. Some messages were heartfelt, thanking them for standing up and inspiring others. Others were more practical, offering advice on dealing with the inevitable media storm that awaited them once they landed. As the flight continued, the reality of their situation began to sink in deeper. They weren't just travelers anymore. They were symbols of something much bigger than themselves. Their calm defiance had struck a nerve, tapping into frustrations and fears that countless people shared but rarely voiced aloud. For years, stories of racial profiling and excessive force at airports had circulated quietly, whispered among communities who felt powerless to challenge the system. But now, thanks to the sisters' courage, those whispers had turned into shouts. People were demanding answers and change. When the plane touched down and the doors opened, reporters were waiting on the other side. Dozens of cameras flashed as the twins stepped off the aircraft, still wearing the same professional outfits they'd had on during the incident. Despite the fatigue etched onto their faces, they held their heads high, refusing to let the scrutiny rattle them. A spokesperson from a civil rights organization greeted them warmly, assuring them they wouldn't have to face the aftermath alone. "You've sparked a conversation that needs to happen," he told them earnestly. "Let us help you turn this moment into meaningful action." Over the following days, the story dominated headlines nationwide. News anchors dissected every detail of the encounter, analyzing the officers' actions and debating whether the use of firearms in such situations was ever justified. Legal experts weighed in, explaining the rights of passengers and the responsibilities of security personnel. Meanwhile, advocacy groups organized rallies outside major airports, holding signs that read slogans like, "Safety shouldn't come at the cost of dignity," and "Enough is enough." The twins became central figures in these discussions, invited to speak at press conferences and community meetings. Their presence at these events was powerful, not because they sought the spotlight, but because they carried themselves with authenticity and grace. When asked about their experience, they didn't mince words. "What happened to us shouldn't have happened to anyone," one of them said during a televised interview. "But we're here now, and we want to make sure no one else has to go through this kind of fear and humiliation." Their message resonated deeply, earning them widespread support from people who admired their strength and conviction. Behind the scenes, investigations into the incident moved swiftly. Internal reviews were launched, and disciplinary actions were announced against the officers involved. While some critics argued the punishments weren't severe enough, others saw them as a step in the right direction, a sign that accountability was possible, even within systems resistant to change. The airport itself implemented new measures aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future, including mandatory de-escalation training for all security staff and increased oversight of checkpoint procedures. Despite these developments, the sisters remained focused on the bigger picture. They knew that true reform wouldn't come overnight. It would require sustained effort and collaboration. To that end, they partnered with advocacy organizations to push for policy changes at both local and national levels. They traveled to different cities, meeting with lawmakers, activists, and everyday citizens to discuss ways to improve airport security protocols and address systemic biases. Each stop along the way reinforced their belief that progress was possible, even if it required patience and persistence. Back home, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, or as normal as it could be after becoming accidental public figures. Friends and neighbors often stopped them on the street to express admiration or gratitude. Some shared personal stories of discrimination they'd faced while traveling, finding solace in knowing they weren't alone. Others simply thanked the sisters for giving voice to frustrations they hadn't known how to articulate themselves. Through it all, the twins stayed grounded, leaning on each other for support whenever the weight of their newfound role felt overwhelming. They reminded themselves daily why they had chosen to speak up, to create a safer, fairer world for everyone. And though the journey ahead promised to be long and challenging, they faced it with the same resilience that had carried them through that chaotic day at the airport. As weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of their actions continued to spread. Conversations about racial bias and accountability in law enforcement gained renewed urgency, fueled in part by the sisters' unwavering determination to turn a harrowing ordeal into a catalyst for positive change. For the twins, it was proof that even in the darkest moments, courage and unity could light the way forward. And for everyone else, it was a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they refused to stay silent. Months had passed since that unforgettable day at the airport, but the memory of it lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed or heard about the incident. For the twin sisters, life had changed in ways they never could have imagined. They were no longer just ordinary travelers. Their faces had become symbols of courage and resilience. Their story was told and retold, not only in news articles and documentaries, but also in quiet conversations among friends, families, and strangers who found inspiration in their actions. The impact of what they had done stretched far beyond the walls of that terminal. People across the country and even around the world began to reflect on their own experiences with authority figures, sharing stories of unfair treatment or moments when they felt powerless. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags like Stand for Justice and Courage in Action, as people rallied behind the message the sisters had unintentionally sparked, that standing up, even in the face of fear, can lead to real change. For the twins themselves, adjusting to their new roles wasn't easy. At first, they struggled with the constant attention. Every time they stepped outside, someone would recognize them: a shopkeeper, a passerby, even a fellow passenger on public transport. Some wanted to shake their hands, others to hug them, and many simply wanted to say thank you. "You gave me hope," one woman told them during a grocery run, tears welling up in her eyes. "I've been scared to speak out, but seeing you two stand your ground made me realize I don't have to stay silent anymore." While such encounters were heartwarming, they also served as reminders of how much work still needed to be done. The sisters knew their bravery had opened doors, but keeping those doors open required effort, not just from them, but from everyone committed to creating a fairer society. So they threw themselves into advocacy work, traveling to cities where similar incidents had occurred and meeting with communities eager to learn from their experience. One of their most memorable trips took them to a small town where a young family had recently faced racial profiling at a local train station. The parents, visibly shaken, recounted how officers had detained them in front of their children, accusing them of carrying contraband without evidence. When the twins arrived, they didn't come as experts or celebrities. They came as listeners. Sitting around a kitchen table piled high with snacks and notebooks, they shared their own story, encouraging the family to speak openly about their pain and frustration. "It's okay to feel angry," one of the sisters said gently, "but don't let that anger consume you. Use it to push for change." Her words resonated deeply with the couple, who decided to file a formal complaint against the officers involved. More importantly, they joined forces with local activists to organize workshops aimed at educating residents about their rights and building trust between the community and law enforcement. These grassroots efforts became a cornerstone of the twins' mission. They understood that while policy changes were crucial, lasting transformation started at the individual level, with people learning to advocate for themselves and support one another. In every city they visited, they left behind networks of empowered individuals ready to challenge injustice wherever they saw it. Back home, The airport where the incident had occurred underwent significant changes. New protocols were introduced to ensure that security checkpoints operated more transparently and respectfully. Officers received additional training on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity, while supervisors implemented stricter guidelines for the use of force. Cameras were installed throughout the terminal, ensuring that interactions between staff and passengers were recorded and monitored closely. These measures weren't perfect, but they marked important steps toward accountability, a direct result of the twins' unwavering determination to hold those in power responsible. Despite these improvements, the sisters remained vigilant. They knew better than anyone that progress often moved slowly, sometimes frustratingly so. There were days when they felt tired, when the weight of expectation seemed too heavy to bear. On those days, they leaned on each other, drawing strength from their unbreakable bond. "We didn't ask for this," one of them admitted during a rare, quiet moment. "But if we can make things better for even one person, isn't it worth it?" Their perseverance paid off in unexpected ways. Schools began incorporating their story into lessons about civic responsibility and human rights, teaching students the importance of standing up for what's right. Businesses held discussions inspired by their example, encouraging employees to speak out against discrimination in the workplace. Even lawmakers referenced their case when drafting legislation aimed at reforming transportation security policies nationwide. As time went on, the sisters gradually stepped back from the spotlight, allowing others to take the lead in continuing the fight for justice. But their legacy endured. Whenever someone stood up to an unfair rule, questioned an unjust accusation, or refused to back down in the face of intimidation, they carried a piece of the twins' spirit with them. It was a reminder that courage is contagious, that one act of defiance can inspire countless others to follow suit. Today, the sisters live relatively quiet lives, though their phones still buzz occasionally with messages of gratitude from people whose lives they touched. They smile whenever they hear about someone using their story as motivation to stand up for themselves or others. To them, that's the greatest reward, the knowledge that their actions planted seeds of change that continue to grow long after the cameras stopped rolling. And every now and then, when they pass through an airport checkpoint, they pause for a moment, remembering the chaos and courage of that fateful day. They glance around at the travelers bustling past, unaware of the history embedded in those halls. Then, with a quiet nod to each other, they move forward, carrying not just their luggage but also the lessons of resilience, unity, and hope. Because they know that even in the busiest, most chaotic places, ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and sometimes those moments change the world.